Hello and welcome to the Research Slayer podcast. We're very excited. This is our second episode, and we're going to be talking about the Canadian revival of psychedelic research. And I'm here with Angela Smith, who's my co-host.
Thank you for having me. This is really exciting.
So we've been studying up, doing some research, because we, researchers, that's what we do. We did some research around psychedelics, and we're really seeing a revival in this area of research, and both of us come from the cannabis industry, so it's interesting to kind of see another plant-based drug that's being used for a number of indications. So we're really excited to have this podcast today, and we're interviewing today Rotem Petranker. He is the co-director and co-founder of both the Psychedelic Studies Research Program at University of Toronto. So it's really interesting to see University of Toronto looking at this area of study as well. And he's also the co-founder of the Toronto Centre for Psychedelic Science. So we had a really great and interesting talk with him. He kind of talked about kind of his thoughts on psychedelic research and also kind of the research that he's doing and really exciting research that he's about to start looking at people with stress. I mean, Angela, what were your thoughts on our interview with him?
Well, Rotem had a lot of interesting insights, and he's right in the thick of the research, so he knows a lot of the history actually that dates back decades and before these psychedelic drugs were really put under a controlled substance framework. So sort of late 1960s to 1970, and so he acknowledges during our discussion, that a lot of researchers have, laid the groundwork, both in sort of that golden era or those early research years. And, really since about 1970, we're talking about, probably 25 to 30 years of really formal research being halted on psychedelic drugs. And, this is interesting when you think about similar controlled substances, including cannabis, which is of course where Sabrina and I have background and research knowledge. Very, very similar situation with a stigma associated with the drugs. Of course, psychedelics are their own class of drugs. They really do need to be used in a controlled framework to ensure that patients are being monitored closely in case they have any unwanted experiences during their treatment.
And it's interesting that Canada is such a strong area in terms of psychedelic research, which is what I'm really interested in as well. So in 1950s, Saskatchewan was really the home for some of the most important research in the world, and it was interesting because it was a Saskatchewan-based psychiatrist by the name of Humphry Osmond that actually coined the word psychedelic in 1957. So, it's always good to kind of see, where Canada is kind of the forefront of anything. And we definitely are when it comes to psychedelics. Mm-hmm. In terms of really the research, we're seeing it in Toronto, in terms of U of T and Toronto Centre for Psychedelic Research. We also see MAPS. MAPS is doing some really amazing research. They've been doing it for a long time. They've really paved the way. So for those of you, MAPS is a multidisciplinary association of psychedelic studies for psychedelic studies, and we're seeing large-scale study phase 3 PTSD that's happening in a lot of other places, but also across Canada. And where else are we seeing research in psychedelics?
I think MAPS is interesting because it has both a global framework, and then we have right on the ground here in Canada with MAPS Canada and Vancouver being also a hotbed of research where those that phase 3 trial of MDMA, which is interesting. You'll hear Rotem's perspective on, sort of we have this umbrella of, psychedelic or psychedelic-like substances where really a general person will think, oh, MDMA or ecstasy is a psychedelic similar to LSD and psilocybin. But actually, from his point of view, they actually exert different effects within the body, so he's actually separating what those drug classes are.
And, just for those of you that, I think most people know what psychedelics is, but just in terms of, because we're talking about psychedelics more from a medical perspective, and we're talking about it from kind of a drug perspective. I think a lot of us know what psychedelics are. Just to talk about it as a definition in terms of the psychedelic drug itself as a medicine. Psychedelic drug or hallucinogen is any of the so-called mind-expanding drugs that are able to induce states of altered perception and thought. Also frequently with heightened awareness of sensory input, but with diminished control over what is being experienced. I think that's a really good definition. I think it covers kind of what we hear in terms of experiences that people have using psychedelics. And
I think that goes back also to why it has been a controlled class of drugs for a number of years, due to the regulatory community not being on board with there potentially being medical benefit to it, but also the diminished control over what is being experienced. That's where a potential risk is to this category. And I think we get some great insights during this podcast about microdosing and people's experiences with microdosing, which really is what Rotem alludes to as being a sub-hallucinogenic experience.
And Rotem talks about kind of the survey that he's done with quite a bit of people that share their experience of microdosing. So it's interesting to kind of see what people communicate as kind of their experience with microdosing. It's interesting that he said the lower doses were more therapeutic.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was really interesting in terms of what they found in the survey that he's done.
The mantra that more is not necessarily better. And this is especially true for what I'll call sensitive type of drug class, such as these psychedelics that are really part of this revival of research, both here in Canada and globally.
So, we're so excited about this. Not only are we doing a podcast, but we're also, we have an upcoming event. The Clinical Research Association of Canada is doing an event on psychedelic research. Also, the event is called the Canadian Revival of Psychedelic Research. And we actually are so excited to have Mark Hayden, who will be speaking. He's the Executive Director of MAPS Canada. So we're very excited. He's going to be talking about the amazing work that they've done. And as you know, MAPS has really led the way and paved the way for psychedelic research. And we have Iris Selkirk. She actually is the co-founder and director of the world's first legal psychedelic resort in Jamaica. So that's exciting. She also has another company that deals with psychedelics as well. So we're very excited to have her, and really excited to kind of hear about what her experience has been with people going to the resort and using psychedelics as well. We have Jackie Childs, who's also going to talk about her personal experience, and it's always important to kind of understand that patient experience. And she has a great story, and she'll talk about how she's now pharma drug free on cannabis and psychedelics, and how that's helped with depression, how that's helped with anxiety and PTSD. So it's really interesting to get a real case, an anecdotal case that kind of goes through what she's done, how she's journaled, what doses and microdosing she's done, and how that has helped her be able to kind of thrive in her career. She's a major social influencer. There's a lot of demands on her in her work, and it's great to see how she's able to cope with all of that on no pharma drugs and just cannabis and psychedelics. So without further ado, we're going to talk to Rotem and get some further insights about psychedelics and psychedelic research and this growing area of research that's happening right now, and this revival that's happening right now in Canada. So hope you enjoy, and we're really excited about this interview with him. Hello and welcome to the Research Layer podcast. So this is episode 2, and today we're going to be talking about the Canadian revival of psychedelic research. And we're here with Rotem Petranker, and he is the co-director and co-founder of both the Psychedelic Studies Research Program at University of Toronto, and also the founder of Toronto Centre for Psychedelic Science. And I'm also here with Angela Smith, who's my co-host.
Hello.
Excited to have her here.
Very excited to be here.
So I'll start with the first question. Maybe we can start with just what is psychedelics. Maybe you can give us a little 101 on that.
Sure. It's a pretty kind of nebulous definition because some people, for example, include MDMA under the umbrella of psychedelics. Some people include iboga, which is a whole other, in my opinion, class of substances. So it depends on how you want to define it. I like the definition of what's referred to as the classic psychedelics. So magic mushrooms, and the active ingredient in them is psilocybin, and then LSD, and the third substance in this category is DMT. All these molecules are very, very similar, and they perform very similar roles in the body.
Okay, great. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, what is psychedelics being used for? We're seeing kind of mental health as a big area. So maybe you can go through what we will start seeing in terms of the indications.
Sure. So I, again, exclude MDMA from this conversation because it's my opinion that it's quite different. It's often referred to as an empathogen, and it does not cause any hallucinations. So I'm not going to be talking about MDMA, which in itself looks very promising, but that's for another conversation. For psychedelics, so far we've seen really promising results for depression, for anxiety, especially when those are around existential issues. So the largest effect sizes to date have been on people with stage 4 cancer, so people who are likely to die quite soon, and they feel really bad about that. And then they take a large dose of psilocybin, and when they come back from that, all of a sudden they just want to appreciate whatever amount of life they have, and they want to spend time with their loved ones, things like that. So I think that is one direction that's very promising. There have also been a few very promising but small scale to date studies on smoking cessation and other substance use studies. Again, very promising. There's currently one large-scale study on substance use that I'm aware of out of NYU. They are aiming to recruit 100 people that have alcohol use problems. And so far, again, the evidence is very promising, but they still need to complete recruitment and analyze the data and all that. So this is kind of on the clinical side. I'm sure there are more things. There's studies ramping up for a variety of other indications like eating disorders, PTSD. There's really a huge variety, but I think that it's also important to mention the potential of psychedelics for enhancing the well-being of people who are not sick. And this is in line with a lot of the research that happened in the 50s and 60s, like, can psychedelics help with creativity, or give us better attention span, or just make us flourish a little more if we're already happy.
Some people say more connected to the environment, more connected to things and people and things like that. Yeah,
for sure. That's something that people in my research have reported. And I think that it's also, I think that connectedness is something, if you're unhappy, if you're depressed, feeling connected will help you feel better. If you're fine, feeling connected will make you feel better. So it's one of those things that I think psychedelics have the potential to move the entire bell curve a little to the right to make people better.
Amazing. I know there's a lot of talk about depression, especially that in the last 30 years that there's not been really any new drugs out. And so it's interesting to see that's such a big area of mental health, and there's not as much focus. And so I think that's kind of a big piece for psychedelics, for sure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about kind of how people have used it in the past in terms of dosages and stuff, and then the whole thing about microdosing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, what are the benefits with microdosing?
Sure. We don't know. We don't know if there are benefits of microdosing. We don't know if it's safe.
Yeah.
Microdosing is something that was introduced in the first kind of the golden age of psychedelic research, and no one really pursued it very much. Jim Fadiman has been kind of trying to pursue that ever since, but the problem is that the research methods that they had back then are kind of irrelevant for how we do science now. So it's quite difficult to take their results. I wouldn't say we can't take them seriously, but they're not conclusive. So we need to replicate their findings. So far, there have been a handful of studies on microdosing. None of them has been a randomized control trial, double blind, none of that. So what we have so far is, out of my group, we've published findings from one large study that was an online survey. We're about to publish another one that's from another large survey. Those are interesting, but they're not, lab studies.
At least they kind of show what people are actually doing, right? And what maybe the outcomes are of that, potentially
give good insights
to move forward.
Would you say?
So that's why we modeled our studies the way we did. The intention was to so we had kind of two paths. One was pre-registered research, which I would like to talk about more if we have time, but we uploaded all of our research design before we started collecting data, and we had specific hypotheses we wanted to prove or disprove. And then the other path was more exploratory. We wanted to see what people are reporting that the benefits and challenges associated with microdosing are. And from those qualitative reports, we built a taxonomy. And then what we are aiming to do is a microdosing study that we will start soon, which will be a randomized control trial, double-blinded, the works. So we will test out these specific categories that we have developed from what people were reporting.
So can you share any information in terms of what you've seen in terms of the microdosing? Or?
So what we found is that overall, the mental health of those who microdose was significantly better than those who don't microdose. And we found that microdosers are also more open-minded, more wise, which is a tricky thing to define, but we use the validated scale for wisdom, so that's the best we have in the discipline. And we also found that microdosers were more creative, and in our design, the creativity question was the only one that actually involved a task. So people actually had to do something. It wasn't just self-report, yeah, of course I'm more creative. So it's pretty easy to have, confirmation bias when it comes to, I've been microdosing, well, I'm going to report that my mental health is better because I want it to be better, or I believe that it is better. But when it comes to performing a task, it's hard to fake the results.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Did you want to go into maybe talking to the research since we've already kind of started?
Sure. There's lots more. So in terms of what people were reporting qualitatively, the three most commonly reported benefits were improved mood by a large margin, the best improvement, the largest amount of participants reported that. And then the second one was improved focus and attention. And then the third was enhanced creativity. And then because we're unbiased, we want to also, we care about what's good, but we also care about what's bad. So we asked about the three main challenges associated with microdosing. And so again, by a wide margin, the most commonly reported challenge was illegality. So people were saying that they don't like the idea of having to buy drugs on the black market, that they don't know what's in them, that they don't know how often to dose, and how they don't know how much they're getting. And then the second most common challenge was physiological discomfort, stuff like feeling hot or cold, having trouble sleeping, sweaty palms. So real symptoms, but I think that these symptoms compared to medicine you can buy off the shelf they're pretty negligible. And then the third most common challenge, which is it's not in itself a thing, we categorize it as other, because it was kind of a catch-all phrase for a lot of just miscellaneous stuff. Included things like, it was mostly calls for more research. I don't know if this is conflicting with my drugs, with the drugs I'm already taking.
Right.
I don't know if this is safe long term. Things like, I don't know how often to take it, and I don't like that I have to remember to take it as often as I do. So those are some of the things we already have published, and there are a couple of other forthcoming papers. One of them is really about analyzing, at the end of our survey, we asked if there's anything else you want to say about microdosing, and we haven't asked you about, this is the place to say it. And because we had so many participants, we had about 1,000 participants. So we had, I think, 127 viable qualitative reports that we then analyzed, and it appears, I will say that the overall theme was that people often would start microdosing because they wanted to treat some clinical symptom, and what they ended up getting out of it is more the theme that kept arising, and I think is super important, and we actually just spoke about it, is connectedness. That people feel really detached and kind of disconnected from their peers, their family, their lives. And all of a sudden they start feeling like the things around them really matter. And so I think that is really, really interesting. And then the other paper that's forthcoming is based on the Global Drug Survey last year. Sample size was something like 120,000 people. So yeah, major.
That's huge.
And we wanted to replicate our previous findings about what are the three main benefits and three main challenges. And they mostly replicated, but I don't want to spoil it. It'll be published soon, and then people can read it.
Excellent. How soon?
Hopefully in a few months.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, like the draft is ready. We just need to send it for review. There will be probably a back and forth, but it's a solid paper. It'll be published.
Maybe we can add it as a link
on
our podcast when it comes out. That'd be great.
Yeah. And then I hypothesized that there's this trend in psychedelics, not research, and the people who in the psychedelic communities, to say that when you have a psychedelics experience, you need to kind of lean into it. You need to be more like approach motivated rather than avoidance. And so I hypothesized that people who report starting microdosing because they wanted to approach something rather than avoid something would have more benefits. There's a large swath of problems with this operationalization, but what we found is overall that people who actually had an avoidance motivation reported more benefits, so contrary to our hypothesis.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so again, there are a lot of methodological issues with this, so I would be really like, this is a maybe. We need to follow up on this in real life, maybe do some kind of a lab study. But this is an interesting preliminary result.
It's interesting because I'm sure we could think of a lot of people that can use to be more connected. You know, because we're so connected to our phone, we're so connected to our jobs, we don't unplug. So, like when you say that, you know, just even looking at people just for well-being, I think that's pretty significant too, because I think that this can be a wellness thing as well as specific for certain indications that you talked about.
I think you're interesting that you said one of the challenges was identified by your cohort was their challenges with the illegal nature of the psychedelics they were using, and I think along with the large stigmatization that these classes of substances have, you know, I'm sure it's a challenging but rewarding area to be in. I wanted if you could give us insight on why did you decide to focus your studies and your research on psychedelics?
Sure. I was actually doing something different before. I was studying mindfulness for a couple of years. I'd been practicing meditation for, 15 years, and it seems to have really good benefits for me, for some people. And I was really interested in the research, and I wanted to just do it well, you know? But I think mindfulness, perhaps comparably with cannabis, it was more like everyone's doing it, and now the research just needs to prove that it works.
Right. Yes.
I think that this is a major issue. So I kind of left that area with a modicum of disgust. I don't want to be associated with this kind of questionable research practices that have, I think, in no small part were involved with the current replication crisis. So when I started studying psychedelics, it was because of I was like, wow, this is cool. This is an awesome opportunity. This field is burgeoning, and I could really do something interesting here. And I have a huge amount of faith in the potential of these substances. But in the time that has passed since I started doing this research, I have come to see that it's quite possible for psychedelics to take the same trajectory as cannabis and mindfulness. People are out to show that it works. People are out to make a big buck. And I don't like that at all. So this whole pre-registration thing, I am a strong proponent of open science, and so where I see myself in the field right now is kind of setting the bar for what is considered adequate science, so that we can all benefit long-term rather than having people, short-term bolster their own careers, publishing papers that quote-unquote show that it works, because that's bad for everyone.
No, I'm really glad you're doing that, because it must be exciting to be kind of a trailblazer in that space and kind of, being able to set the bar like you said. Well, I think that's what we need people to do right off the get-go. You know what I mean?
I agree with you, and I wish that I could say that this is actually who I am and what I do, but in reality, this is what I would want to do.
Yeah.
History will say if it worked out or not, but this is what I'm trying to do right now.
Interesting. So could you explain a little more the pre-registration as well as open science? Because I think you're right. Like, I think as I think about academic careers and or academic framework and or more of the industry framework, it does come back to publishing or presenting results to either journals or to regulatory bodies. How does the way that you're pre-registering and using open science work within this framework, and how will it look in the future, if you have any insight on that?
Sure. So I think that open science is important, and I'm sure that the researchers who listen to this podcast know that also the Tri-Council and various other funding agencies now require data management plans when you apply for funding. So I'm happy that they're finally catching on. It didn't even take them so long, so that's great. I think that we need more transparency, and we need more accountability, and we need more replications. So what I'm trying to push right now, there's a piece that myself, along with Thomas Anderson and Norman Farb, are currently writing, and it's going to be published soon. And it's an invited piece for Frontiers in Psychology. It's going to be published soon. and we kind of talk about why it's so important to practice open science and psychedelics specifically. So I think short term, it's because you front load your project, so you think in advance of all the things you're going to have to do, rather than after you've collected the data, you sit there in front of a huge Excel sheet and you're like, oh no, what do I do now? I need to figure out which analyses to run. So you figure all of that out in advance, and then you can make sure that your study design matches what you actually want to learn. And then in the long run, what I'm hoping would happen is that there's so many ambitious junior researchers that are just looking for data sets to work with. And so I'm hoping that they could try and rerun certain analyses just to, get the practice. And I'm hoping that we could encourage graduate students when they do their graduate work to not just build on what other people have done before, but for a part of their project to actually be a replication of previous work.
That's really interesting. I think I totally agree with you on the transparency and the accountability. As we've seen research frameworks advance, and this goes back to saying, how do we compare the sort of golden era of psychedelics, pre that really controlled substances prohibition, to what's resurging now. That open science sounds like it will be a critical aspect as we advance it, especially in this area of psychology. So that's really interesting. I think also speaking to where the research is going, if we can talk more broadly for a moment and sort of what's happening on sort of the medical front. We're aware that FDA has given psilocybin sort of that breakthrough therapy or fast track designation in recent months, looking at it for specific indications for use. Maybe you can comment on that. And also, what do you feel that this means that the FDA has acknowledged a fast track process for the future of this research?
I think it's really cool. I think that it shows that bureaucrats can be convinced by data, which is encouraging to me. And they don't have to move super slowly. I mean, I think that in the States, so Rick Doblin started MAPS in 1986. That's the year I was born. So it's taken a good long while to get the kind of recognition that they're getting now.
Sorry, I love that psychedelic started the year you were born. Just want to highlight that.
I mean, it's MAPS started.
Or MAPS.
Yeah.
Sorry, MAPS.
That's thousands of years of psychedelics, but MAPS specifically. Yeah, that's a very good coincidence for you and your career.
So I think that in a historical perspective, Rick Doblin and people like Amanda Fielding and others have done a ton of work to get to where we are now, to get to it so that it's taken me a long time, but I will ultimately get this microdosing study up and running. And it's largely thanks to the groundwork that other people have done. So I want to acknowledge that. And I think by the same token, the FDA approval now, we see it as kind of a watershed moment, but it's important to acknowledge that a lot of stuff has happened to lead up to this.
That's a great point.
I'm hoping that what happens next is that I don't think that that psychedelics need to be legalized now or next year or anything like that. What I'm hoping is that it'll be easier to do research, and I don't think that's going to happen because the US government has made some kind of executive decision. I think that this will happen over time when we run more studies and we show that the risk profile of these substances is negligible.
I think it's pretty significant that that's happened. You know what I mean? It shows that, psychedelics have shown that there's more efficacy in certain endpoints than other drugs, right, for the same indication. So I think it's pretty significant that, at least that's happening, that kind of really puts some legitimacy with psychedelics, for sure. So
I don't know that there's been a comparison between psychedelics and treatment as usual, but what I want to propose is that, let's say, even like in the case that psychedelics and treatment as usual, say SSRIs, are equally effective, psychedelics would still be far superior because their side effects are so negligible, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
just thinking about your comment on side effects, and for people who aren't that familiar with sort of what we're talking about with using psychedelics in therapy, could you kind of walk us through, like, is it a pop a pill and go, or is it a very structured treatment protocol as the research that's already been done and that's advancing?
So the work that's been done on large doses is always very structured. It includes a few therapy sessions before and after administering the substance. And it's a very, very intense experience. A part of the reason I'm interested in microdosing is because it's subperceptual. So, or perhaps a better description would be subhallucinogenic. You pop a pill and go about your day. And so, and at least if we are to believe what our participants said, worst side effect is kind of physiological symptoms that are kind of inconvenient, or people were reporting a little bit of mental confusion or stuff like that. It's not terrible, and it may be worth it for some people. So I'm not thinking about it as something that would necessarily replace all of the existing medication, but rather another tool in our toolkit.
So maybe we'll swing right back, and maybe you could tell us about the study that you have that's coming up.
Sure. So this is in collaboration with CAMH. The intention is to run an 8-week study that will have a crossover washout design. So we have 2 groups that come in once a week for 8 weeks. Group 1 starts with the active substance, and on week 5 they switch over to placebo. And group 2 starts with placebo, and on week 5 they switch over to the active substance. And so the idea is to see, sure, what are the acute effects of psilocybin, which is the substance we'll be using, but also to see if there are changes over time in the way people behave, and to see how long it takes for those changes to wash out.
And you're looking at well-being.
So we're looking at a variety.
Oh, okay.
So we're looking at a variety of variables, and they are all based on our survey work where people reported things. And so we have a lot of measures. So they include things like, well-being, but also creativity, attention, mindfulness. There's a lot there.
And are you looking at people with depression or people without any kind of condition? Like, what's the kind of inclusion exclusion in terms of the patient you're looking for?
So no current diagnosis.
Okay.
But we do want people who are moderately stressed.
Okay.
So we're trying to find people who are stressed enough, who score high enough on a depression scale so that there's enough variability to move.
I think we have 2 right here.
Okay.
It might be a big pool that you just don't realize out there in today's society.
I realize.
Okay.
All of us. That work.
Yeah, but we don't want them to be so depressed that they are actually, clinically diagnosed.
Right. Okay. And I'm going to ask a little bit more questions about the study itself. So obviously when you do a clinical trial, you need a GMP type of product. And is that something that you're able to source and stuff too for this type of study?
Yeah. There's a not-for-profit out of the US by the name of USONA.
Excellent.
And they are providing us free of charge, and we give them our safety data.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Because that's always the challenge with, especially when there's a lot of stuff in the legal market to be able to get a GMP product.
It took them a long time to get ready. I was ready before them.
Oh, okay. I can imagine.
And I'm not the only one, but this is again another conversation, but there's a company called Compass Pathways. They kind of control the market, or did until USONA came up with their own supply.
And then the other question too, obviously, with pharma companies, they have a budget, right, in order to be able to do all these clinical trials, and that's been the challenge with cannabis, and it probably is the challenge with psychedelics. Is there funding that you find that people are willing to fund? I mean, obviously, someone was willing to fund the study, for example.
Yeah, I have been looking for funding long and hard and far and wide, and it's been a process.
That's a big challenge between getting the GMP product and the funding.
Yeah, so funding was actually the easiest. I was very fortunate to come across the Singal Health Foundation, and they have given us $350,000. And once you get the first kind of chunk, it's easier to keep the ball rolling. So there's more money coming in. For example, there's this group called Molecule Catalyst. They're a new company, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to revolutionize the way pharmaceutical development takes place. So they want to kind of make it a more crowd-funded type thing. Okay. So they have a platform that uses bit or blockchain technology for validation, and there's currently a campaign that they're running for us, and they will pass 100% of the proceeds to this study. So I think they're aiming to raise $150,000 for us, and I think they started 10 days ago and they already have like $10,000, so it's going well.
Nice.
Yeah, and so it's just, there have been a lot of companies that approached us and wanted to give us money for, no big deal, just the intellectual property. To which to which we respond, thanks, but open science comes first. So we rather do it right or not do it at all. And it has been an absolute delight to turn down big amounts of money in return for retaining my values. So it feels good.
Oh, great. We need more of that in other industries. So maybe just to wrap up, the last question is, I mean, where do you see this industry or psychedelic research and psychedelic as a medicine in maybe in the next 5 years? Or what is your hope anyways?
My hope is that everyone pre-registers and has open data and materials, and that everyone replicates a little bit of everyone else's research, so that we know that we're building on a strong, solid foundation of science. My hope is that at least some scientists remain focused on the scientific pursuit and will not get blinded by the money, because there's a lot of money in this area right now. And I hope that we find great ways to optimally dispense and utilize these substances.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up episode 2.
It was great chatting with you today, and I really learned a ton about this area that is emerging, feels quickly.
I feel like it just came up.
Yeah, it just popped up on everybody's radars, and so we really appreciate your point of view on this fascinating area of research.
Thank you.